don't really need to tell this audience that one of the main reasons why we are concerned about invasive alien species is because of their impacts. And I think the impacts on biodiversity have been a concern for many decades now. It was in the early 2000s that the Convention on Biological Diversity recognized invasive alien species as what they considered the second biggest threat to biological diversity after habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. More recently, IPBES has recognized impacts of invasive species much more broadly, because over the last decade or two, our understanding of invasive species impacts has expanded to include impacts on ecosystem services and on various aspects of human well-being. And so a more recent definition recognizes that. What I'll try and do in today's talk is give a bit of an overview of the state of the knowledge, if you like, of invasive species impacts in India. And then I'll come down to focus on two species that my collaborators and I have worked on extensively. And then later I'll try and see what all of this might mean also for how we inform management. So to do the first part, which is a review, I'm going to draw on the recent IPBES report. I had the privilege of being an author on the chapter that looked at invasive species impacts, and I'm drawing on a database that we put together for this chapter. The data are in the process of being published, so the database will be openly accessible very soon to answer some of the questions that were raised a short while ago. But just to give you a brief overview of the data set, this was compiled by 14 chapter authors and a number of different contributing authors. It comprises more than 22,000 records of over 3,000 invasive species, and it looked at all kinds of sources, so not just peer-reviewed literature, but also the gray literature. And it looked at various different kinds of impacts, so impacts on nature, impacts on ecosystem services, which in the IPBES terminology is called impacts on nature's contributions to people, and also impacts on various aspects of human well-being. So just, looking at extracting the data for India, there were about almost 550 reports of invasive species impacts from India, covering almost 140 different species. It's probably not surprising that the largest number of reports are for invasive plants, followed by the other invasive species taxa. What might be surprising is the number of reports on vertebrates. But if you look at the different realms from which these reports come, you see that for all the other taxa, the number of reports of invasive species impacts from terrestrial ecosystems dominate. In the case of vertebrates, it is from freshwater ecosystems, and that should give you a clue. This is all to do with introduced fish species. Going taxon by taxon, just these broad categories: plants, vertebrates, invertebrates, and microbes. As I said, the greatest number of records is for plants. But again, I want to point out something here. There are several people in this room, Anzar and Achyut, who have been very instrumental in helping to document invasive alien species, invasive alien plants for India. And I think the current accepted number of invasive alien plants in India is about 220. There are only about 45 species of plants for which we have any reports of impacts. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is that 5 invasive alien plants, that's Lantana, Prosopis, Capophycus, which is a seaweed, Parthenium, and Ageratum connozoides, 5 species amongst them contribute 50% of all records on invasive species impacts in India. So just to give you a sense of the state of knowledge about invasive plant impacts. Similarly, moving on to vertebrates, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, reports are dominated by impacts of introduced fish. The only exceptions to that in the database are the ones that I've starred. That's the cheetal, elephant, Indian bullfrog, and domestic, the house sparrow. And these are vertebrates that have been introduced from the Indian mainland to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. There were many, many species introduced, but these have become invasive there. So has the common myna, but somehow it didn't show up in the literature. Some of you might be familiar with more recent papers. I should also say that you might be wondering why things like the red-eared slider are not here. It could be that they were not published at the time this database was compiled. Then moving on to invertebrates and microbes, the literature is dominated by impacts to crop plants. So again, if you look at the invertebrates, apart from the few that I've starred, which include some mollusks and like the yellow crazy ant, most of the other species are agricultural pests. And here also a word of caution, because this is the agricultural literature, they're not interested in ecological questions. So they may not, in compiling the database, we may have missed a lot of introduced pests that have of crop plants just because they're not, there's no explicit mention that they're introduced, because agricultural scientists are not interested in whether something is, an alien invasive or not. They're just interested in whether it's a pest. So initially I had mentioned different types of impacts that were compiled as part of this database. Impacts on nature would be, whether an invasive species affects individuals of a native species, affects an individual's growth, or whether effects have implications for population growth or community composition or ecosystem processes, whether disturbance regimes or changes to soil composition or changes to the physical structure of ecosystems. And we were able to attribute directionality to some of these impacts. So if a native species was impacted negatively or positively, but impacts to ecosystem processes were not given any directionality because there was no explicit mention on how these impacted native species. So we left those without direction. So in the next graph, when you see impacts on nature, that's not a complete representation because ecosystem impacts are left out of there. Impacts to nature's contributions to people, it's actually matches on to how we consider ecosystem services. And if you look closely at that list, I don't expect you to, there are 18 different categories of NCP, but they kind of correspond to the provisioning, regulating, and cultural, spiritual ecosystem services. And then components of well-being, this is a move away from trying to look at impacts on humans just in monetary terms, because one has tended to look at impacts on livelihoods, but there are other aspects of impacts to human well-being that cannot be quantified monetarily. So this is draws on the capabilities literature to look at well-being in a more holistic sense. So again, now I'm going to move just to plants. But as I said, we know a lot more about impacts on nature, even though this is an incomplete representation, because as I said, ecosystem impacts are not represented here because directionality could not be attributed. We know much less. There are probably half the number of records that look at impacts on different aspects of human well-being. So that seems to be the case not just for India, but globally also. Our understanding of invasive species impacts on constituents of well-being lags far behind our ecological understanding of invasive species. This aspect of the human dimensions of invasive species impacts is just catching up now. Okay, having said that, I'm now going to shift focus away from sort of the broad picture of invasive species impacts in India and focus in on my favorite two species. The first is Lantana, and with colleagues we've worked in BR Hills, which is in southern Karnataka, between the western and eastern Ghats, over several decades now. When we first started working in this landscape, this is a picture from 2001, and large parts of this landscape were this nice open savanna woodland. You would have to comb the landscape to find anything like that anymore. Most of it looks like this, and this is all lantana. We were very lucky in having a data set that we could build on. This was work done by my colleague Dr. Siddhappa Shetty in the late 90s, where he and Dr. Murali, they surveyed the entire 540 square kilometer landscape of the BR Hills, gridded it out into a 2 by 2 kilometer grid, and at the center point of every grid, in a 400 square meter plot, recorded every woody stem 1 centimeter diameter and above. So having access to that data set, again open data, we were able to go back in 2008. Bharat Sundaram did this as part of his PhD work, and then in 2018, a couple of master's students, Arvind from Pondicherry and Subhrajit Goswami from Doon University, came and redid the survey. So we have this 20-year data set of lantana spread across the landscape, and you can see from the darkening map across the screen how lantana density has changed. But in terms of actual numbers of stems, just to give you a sense, in 1997, lantana was 1 in every 20 stems. By 2018, lantana had become 1 in every 2 stems. So every other stem encountered in the forest was lantana. So this change in composition, partly we think is a competition by lantana directly to regeneration of native vegetation. Partly it's an indirect effect because lantana is not palatable, and we heard that earlier today. Herbivores are preferentially browsing on native species, so like an indirect effect of lantana on native vegetation. Partly it is because lantana seems to have changed the fire regimes. So, in this landscape at least, lantana behaves like almost like a climber. It clambers up into tree canopies. So when fires do occur, unlike the cool season fires that the PCCF was talking about, and which we believe used to occur here as well, you get these canopy fires, which are very damaging to the native vegetation. So it could be a series of mechanisms responsible for lantana's success and a reduction in native vegetation. Other aspects of lantana's impacts, again, we've seen some of these kinds of pictures already in the previous session, that it's unpalatable for herbivores. It also changes the three-dimensional structure of this landscape, so it's not as navigable for large herbivores, and a lot of herbivores are moving out from this landscape, and potentially this has implications up the trophic ladder for carnivores as well. In terms of impacts on human beings, again, the PCCF earlier mentioned the lack of forage and animals straying out. Dr. Shankaran also mentioned that, so you get human-wildlife conflict because of crop depredation. In the BR Hills, we've actually seen people having to switch their cropping patterns from the subsistence crops that they used to grow in their lands to cash crops that are not attractive to these herbivores, which comes with its own implications. There have also been documented impacts on NTFP, similar to what I was saying earlier, direct competition from lantana and those indirect impacts of disproportional browsing on regenerating NTFP. So earlier it was thought that people had over-harvested NTFP, leading to its reduction, but long-term studies have shown that it's actually direct and indirect impacts of lantana, which has affected livelihoods of NTFP-dependent communities. And then one that was something that was quite unexpected and new to us. It's obvious in hindsight, but people talking about how lantana has made the forest a more dangerous place. So earlier, because of that open structure, they could walk in the forest and see for long distances. Now, because of the dense understory, it has increased the chance encounters with dangerous wildlife. So, more and more people are deterred from going into the forest. Their access to traditional sacred sites has been reduced, and that's having a knock-on effect on traditional knowledge about the forest. So younger generations are much more alienated from the forest than from their elders. And this is something that we are seeing in the landscape. This is something that we also encountered in consultations with indigenous communities as part of the IPBES report. And we heard this kind of alienation from traditional landscapes, from indigenous communities in other parts of the world as well. Turning to my other case study, this is Prosopis juliflora, and we've worked in the Banni, but I'll also mention some examples from other parts of Kutch. Prosopis was introduced to the Banni. So Banni, for those of you who don't know it, it's in the middle of the Kutch Peninsula, and it has the greater Rann of Kutch to the north, which is a large salt desert. And Prosopis juliflora was introduced to the Banni supposedly in the 1960s as a way to curtail the spread of salinity from the Rann into the grassland. Banni was once considered Asia's largest and finest tropical grassland. It's still about the area that is considered Banni is like 2,500 square kilometers, which is large by Indian standards. And there are still patches of very nice grassland that you can see in the Banni. It has traditionally been home to nomadic pastoralists, the Maldharis, with their traditional livestock breeds, the Kankrij cow and the Banni buffalo. But following the introduction of Prosopis, large parts of Banni also look like this. They've totally been converted into Prosopis woodland at the cost of grassland. And just to give you a more visual sense of this extent, 50 to 60% of Banni is now Prosopis woodland of varying density. As I mentioned, Prosopis was introduced to Banni supposedly to check the influx of salinity from the Rann of Kutch. But when we first started working in Banni, we were told by Maldharis, the local pastoralist community, that they felt that Prosopis had increased salinity in the Banni. So one of the things we were very interested in was trying to understand the eco-hydrological impacts of Prosopis and what it was doing to groundwater and salinity. And the other thing we wanted to try and see was whether experimentally Prosopis could be removed for grassland restoration. So just very briefly, our work on the hydrology of Prosopis, we set up, we use sap flow probes where you can measure the rate at which plants are transpiring water. That gives you a sense of how much groundwater they're drawing. And we did this for Prosopis and a couple of co-occurring native species, the Salvadora persica and the Acacia nilotica. And I want to draw your attention to the wet season and dry season fluxes of water. So think of it as the amount of water a tree is transpiring. And what you see is that both the Acacia and the Salvadora, they have slightly higher transpiration in the wet season and reduced transpiration in the dry season, whereas Prosopis didn't seem to be affected by the seasons at all. It continued the same way through the year. So what was it that Prosopis was doing that the other two species were not able to do? We also had these wells that we had installed in areas with and without Prosopis, and we found that in areas with Prosopis, not only was Prosopis drawing down groundwater on a daily basis, so water levels came down during the day when transpiration was high, and then they refilled at night and came down in the day. And you see that more vividly in that blue line, which is wet season. But if you look closely, you can see those peaks and troughs in the red line also, which is the dry season transpiration. But you also see this seasonal drawdown in groundwater. So even during the dry season, Prosopis is able to access groundwater, which the other two species may not be doing. And the reason they may not be doing it is because in areas with Prosopis, we found much higher salinity of the groundwater compared to areas without. So again, what we think is happening is, Banni is very close to the coast. It's very close to the salt desert. So, we think there's a freshwater lens with the salty saline water table below. And since it is able to draw groundwater, and this groundwater is getting refilled from the surrounding area, that seems to be salinizing the groundwater, which is what the Maldharis had been telling us. And Prosopis seems to happily tolerate high salinity. So that picture on the right, when we were monitoring our sensors in the wells, that's from, I think, 7 meters depth. Every time we'd pull out sensors, live Prosopis roots would come out with the sensors. They were growing in through a crack in the well, the wall of the well. And these seem to be live roots quite happily surviving in high salinity. So apart from salinizing groundwater and having reduced grassland area, Prosopis has also affected wildlife communities. I also want to talk about some of the impacts on human communities. So both in Banni but also in the larger landscape, we encounter this in our dealings with the Maldharis, but there are other published reports about how the spread of Prosopis and the reduction in grazing resources has led to conflicts between communities because they can no longer access grazing resources that they traditionally use, so they're competing over limited resources. Another very interesting and unexpected consequence has been that it has led to breakdown of these long-standing traditional relationships between pastoralist communities and farmer communities. So, these are communities of nomadic pastoralists, and during lean seasons, they would migrate and camp in agricultural fallows. And they're no longer welcome in these agricultural fallows because their livestock help disperse Prosopis. Prosopis fruits are eaten by goats and buffaloes and things. So, these generational relationships are now being soured by Prosopis. Prosopis also is thorny, so it causes injuries to humans and livestock. But then, I've listed a lot of negatives, but Prosopis has also been adapted as a form of alternative livelihoods with reduction in access to grassland resources. So many people have taken to making charcoal from Prosopis, and you get a sense of the magnitude of it from those pictures. I want to switch now to just exploring what knowing impacts of invasive species and how that can inform how we approach management. At a global level, some of you would be familiar with this. IUCN in 2020 has adopted something called the ICAT, the Environmental Impact Categorization of Alien Taxa. And this is an attempt to standardize classifying invasive alien species based on the magnitude of their impacts. So, think of IUCN's red list, which tries to identify which species are threatened, which are vulnerable, etc. This is an attempt to identify which are the most impactful invasive species, if you like, which are less impactful, and so on. Focus is on negative impacts. So the objectives of this are, if we can assign levels of impact to species, then we can compare species based on their impacts. We can also, knowing the maximum possible impact a species can have based on existing data, one can predict what impact a species might have even if in a particular area it doesn't yet have that impact, and it enables prioritizing species for management. And the attempt is that this is a transparent, robust, evidence-based way of classifying species, and that this global database of ICAT classified species is dynamic, because as more data accumulate, as more reports of invasive species impact are gathered, species might get upgraded, if we learn that something has greater impact than was previously known. So just sort of very broadly to give you how it works, think of it as a matrix between sort of magnitude categories and mechanisms of impact. So magnitude would be, as I mentioned, this is ecological impacts of invasive species, so it focuses on impacts on native species and populations. And so the magnitude goes from, hardly any impact on individuals to impacts on populations, all the way to local extinction of populations, and whether or not that local extinction is reversible if you remove the invasive species, or whether it has become irreversible. And so that's the sort of scale of magnitude. And then there can be any number of mechanisms. Again, I don't need to mention to this group, but competition, predation, allelopathy, biofouling, many different mechanisms by which invasive species have impact. So if you're considering a particular taxon or species, there may be numerous studies out there that talk about its impacts, and under the ICAT rules, you would consider the most severe impact, no matter what the mechanism, but the most severe impact is what would give it its categorization. There is also, an interest in devising a similar ranking based on the socioeconomic impacts of invasive species. This is something that is still under development. The framework proposed is very analogous to the ICAT, that let us prioritize species based on their negative impacts on humans. But how do you, what do you consider impacts on people? So again, it's a matrix of impact mechanism, which is, impacts on those well-being categories, and impact magnitude, which is the degree to which impacts on well-being affect people's capabilities. So again, it's an effort to get away from just monetary, trying to quantify impacts in monetary terms, because a number of different impacts, how do you quantify people's feeling of lack of safety? I talked about the Soligas talking about the forest becoming a more dangerous place. You can't put a monetary value on that, but the fact that because of that, certain cultural practices have reduced, now that is an impact, right? And that's what you can rank those kinds of impacts. So this is still under development, but I thought I would just mention it here. Finally, I want to go back to our work in the Banni to say that this is all very well, understanding the magnitude of impacts, looking at negative impacts, but we were really challenged in our work in the Banni when, I mentioned initially that one of the objectives of our work was to also see whether it was possible to restore grasslands by removing Prosopis. And we did this restoration experiment and found that within 3 years, within 4 years rather, we had very good recovery of native vegetation and species richness. But when it came to trying to actually do that restoration, we found it was very contentious. Because Prosopis has become a source of novel livelihoods in that landscape. And 60 to 70% of the Maldharis depend on Prosopis either as a primary source of livelihoods or as a supplementary source of livelihoods. So we were actually physically threatened when we tried to do Prosopis removal because people feel so strongly about this. So, so we then decided that, as outsiders working in this landscape, it was not for us to be prescriptive about management. And we worked with collaborators who are systems dynamics modelers and tried to create a model of the Banni that linked the socioeconomic systems with the biophysical systems and, and allowed us to simulate different management scenarios and then go back to the people and say, okay, let's talk about it. What do you think is the best management? And what emerged from talking to them is similar to what emerged from our model. This is accessible on Google Play. We converted it into an app in 3 languages, English, Hindi, and Gujarati. And so some of you might be interested in taking a look. But it turned out that complete Prosopis removal would enhance livelihoods from pastoralism, but because this is an arid landscape, very vulnerable to droughts, and drought frequency is likely to increase in time with climate change, complete removal is not a desirable outcome, because Prosopis now serves a very important role as risk aversion, especially during drought periods. So some kind of optimal restoration of grassland, but retaining Prosopis on the landscape is what people arrived at, and which also this model kind of leads to. So which brings me to my last slide, that especially in countries like India, where large proportions of people, local communities, indigenous communities, continue to depend on very directly on nature and natural resources, and they are also the most impacted by invasive species coming into these landscapes. They have, in many instances, like in the Banni, evolved adaptations to those invasive species to kind of mitigate their impacts on their livelihoods. And often it is the most marginalized members within these communities also. So when approaching management in these kinds of contexts, it's important to understand the full suite of impacts. It's not just enough to say, this is an ecologically harmful species, and therefore we need to remove it and restore, because without taking into consideration the well-being impacts, as we found, it's not going to work. And I think Dr. Sankaran also mentioned earlier that you have to have all stakeholders involved. So yeah, I'd like to end on that note, that you need a holistic, grounded understanding of impacts, and management in certain situations has to be very, very context specific. So with that, I'll acknowledge all my collaborators and stop.